I can go ahead and start. We'll want to welcome everybody. As chair of this study and of the committee meeting, I want to welcome you. This task is being undertaken by the Committee of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to examine the long-term medical and economic impacts of increasing antimicrobial resistance in the United States. The task being undertaken by this committee includes commenting on progress against the national strategy of combating antimicrobial resistance, and the full task is described on the study website. I want to note that this is an open, on-the-record session. Interested individuals and members of the press have been invited to attend as observers. This is not a news conference, however, and we will not be entertaining questions from the floor. Reporters who would like to talk with committee members are kindly asked to touch base with Jillian Buckley. She's the study director, and her contact information is on the study website. I want to remind everyone this is an information gathering session. That is, the committee is in the process of assembling materials that it will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Therefore, I ask that everyone be mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions and that it would be a mistake for anyone to leave today's meeting thinking otherwise. Comments made by individuals, including committee members, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the National Academies. Committee members typically ask probing questions in these information gathering sessions that may not be indicative of their personal views. The committee will deliberate thoroughly before writing its draft report. Moreover, once this draft report is written, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee, and the committee must then respond to that review with appropriate revisions that adequately satisfy the National Academy's Report Review Committee and the National Academy of Sciences president before it is considered an official National Academies report. So thank you, welcome again. I'm going to turn it briefly over to Jillian, and we'll have this session for the next hour.
I know that Chris Moore from CIDRAP, so as many of you know, and I know Chris will cover this as well, but we commissioned Chris and her team at CIDRAP to look more closely at the progress the various agencies made against their targets in the 2015 to 2020 National Strategy on combating antimicrobial resistance. And Chris and Angie have done a lot of work on that this winter, and that's what she's going to present to us. So thank you, Chris, and I'll just turn it over to you.
Okay, so let me pull up my slides. Bear with me for just a second here while I do this. I think this should come up. Can you all see that? Is that a yes? Good. Okay, great. Okay. So what I'm going to be doing, what I'm going to be doing is just talking about the National Action Plan for Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria 2015 to 2020. I'll be giving a quick update on that and kind of outline for you our progress to date. First, I want to do some acknowledgements. First off, I would like to thank my colleague, Angie Mayer. She is listening in. She's with me at CIDRAP. We are the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. And Angie did a lot of the heavy lifting for this. I mean, she did all the project management, kept everything organized, all of our conversations, took all the notes, did most of the research. Was really just extremely helpful, and I deeply appreciate her support. And I'd like to also acknowledge my federal agency contacts. I will outline that a little bit in just a moment. And I would also like to thank the committee for this opportunity to present to you today. Very much appreciate that. And lastly, I want to thank Jillian Buckley for her support and for her engaging with us in this effort. So these are all of the federal agency contacts who participated in this effort. And I'm not going to go through this whole list. Obviously, you can see there were a lot of folks. We engaged with almost every agency that's involved in the CARB plan. And I will talk about those a little, exactly what our methodology was in a few minutes. But I do want to say that it was a real pleasure talking to these folks. They were extremely cooperative, extremely helpful, really pleasant we were on the phone with them and a lot of email exchanges with them. And I just very much appreciate their time. I know these are extremely busy people. And the other point I wanted to make is I think they're extremely dedicated. These are people who really care about this topic and they care about the outcome. And it's great to be engaged with people who are in that position. So thank you to each of you. I don't know if any of you are listening, but we very much appreciate your support and time on this project. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our charge and scope, just to make sure that's very clear to everyone. I'll give you a little bit of background in our methods, how we collected this information. I'll provide a very short quantitative summary. And then I'm going to go into some agency-specific highlights, some primary challenges and barriers, some key lessons learned, and close with just one slide on antibiotic resistance trend. And then I'll have a concluding slide. Let's see if I can get rid of that. Okay, so just to be clear, our charge that we spoke with Jillian was really to examine progress on the National Plan for Combating Antibiotic Resistant Bacteria. So what we're summarizing today is progress on the goals, objectives, and milestones, mostly focusing on the milestones in the 2015-20 plan. We really aren't going beyond that in terms of other efforts, and we really didn't do like an overall analysis, kind of like what was done with the GAO report. We really didn't have time to do that kind of thing. And also that wasn't what we were charged to do. So what you're going to hear is basically a summary of progress where we're at so far. Next slide, please. So you're all aware of this, but just to remind everyone, there are 5 goals that are outlined in the 2015-2020 plan. One is slow the emergence of resistant bacteria and prevent the spread of resistant infections. 2 is strengthen the national One Health surveillance efforts to combat resistance. 3 is advanced development and use of rapid and innovative diagnostic tests for the identification and characterization of resistant bacteria. 4 is accelerate basic and applied R&D for new antibiotics, other therapeutics, and vaccines. And then finally, improve international collaboration and capacities for antibiotic resistance prevention, surveillance and control, and antibiotic R&D. Next slide, please. So just to be clear on what our methods were, we started out with the plan, and then we outlined all of the milestones that are in the plan, and then we pulled those apart by agency. So we created agency-specific tables as a result of that, like we created a table for NIH, a table for CDC, et cetera. And what we did, there were many milestones, I'm sure you've all read the plan, that have CDC, FDA, USDA will all do X. So what we did in that situation was we put that same milestone in the CDC table, the FDA table, and the USDA table to separate them out so that we could collect the information. Our plan before we submit a final report to you is we will put that all back together into one long table. It'll probably be about a couple hundred pages, but we'll put it back together for you so you can see the progress for each milestone and what the agency responses were. So our first step was to create these agency-specific tables. And then we tried to determine if a milestone had been met or partially met, or what the status of each milestone was. And in doing that, we reviewed all the past progress reports from ASPE that are on the ASPE website. We also looked at the 2020 GAO report on antibiotic resistance. And then we conducted some pretty extensive online searching just to find relevant documents, just sort of general searches within agency websites to see if we could come up with evidence to support that a milestone was completed. So once we did that, we had the milestone, and then we have the status of the milestone, and then we have whether or not, what is the evidence to support that milestone has been completed. So we sent those tables to the appropriate agencies for review. And we did that partly because there's a lot of information that we just simply could not find online. Some of these are process objectives. Some of them they didn't yield a product of any kind that could be identified. And so we really wanted to, we felt it was really essential to talk to all the agencies. So we sent them the tables, and then we held one or more Zoom calls with the agency personnel to clarify any questions that we had and to fill in gaps in the table. And sometimes that was a couple calls. Some of that work was also done via email, and we kind of went back and forth a little bit. And then we got to the point where we were satisfied that we had a disposition for essentially every milestone that's in the plan. And then once we finalized those tables, we sent them back one last time to the agencies to give them, an opportunity to review it and say, yeah, this is accurate. And we did that for that reason. We sent it back to them because we wanted to be sure that we had captured some of the conversations, which were verbal conversations, that we had translated that into the correct language for the report. So we felt it was very important that we circle back to the agencies and make sure that they were okay with the process and okay with where we ended up with their individual table. Now, one small exception, there were a couple small exceptions. A couple of agencies we actually did not directly meet with. We did, if they had just a couple milestones or a few things, we did it via email, but the same process of going back and forth a bit. And then with NIH, we did have a call with NIH. We talked to them extensively about some of the other questions we had, but they sent us a very, very nice table in which they outlined all their progress. They had kind of done a lot of what we had done, but just for NIH. And so it was very easy for us to look at that and see the evidence for supporting completion of milestones. And we're using a lot of that information in the table that we put together. So that was actually very, very helpful for us. Next slide, please. Okay, so in conclusion, then, the agency tables outline the status of each milestone and supporting evidence. We felt it was very important to have that supporting evidence. And I will say, in some instances, the supporting evidence was the conversation with that we had via Zoom, where they said, yes, we did this, and then they gave us kind of how they did it or why that, how it happened, whatever that milestone was, if there was no other documentation. So some of it was verbal from the agencies, but we felt if they gave us enough information, we felt that was adequate to constitute the evidence that we were looking for. During these conversations, we also asked agency personnel several questions. What were their primary accomplishments these past 5 years? What are some of the challenges and barriers they had to completing their work? And what were the key lessons learned? So I'm compiling that information, and that's what I'll be sharing. And so I also just wanted to note that that this project was kind of compressed. We had some contracting issues that got a little bit delayed. And so we didn't have a lot of time to collect this. So we just had our last agency call last week. And we have a couple of agencies that have not yet signed off on their table. So things could change a little bit. I don't think there'll be much, but we might have a couple of small changes as we finalize this for the final report. So again, this is preliminary information. I think it's quite accurate, but we may see some little tweaks when we submit the final report to you in July. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a little bit of a quantitative summary. You can see that we have the agencies listed there on the left, and then we have the total number of milestones for that agency. This slide does not add up to the total number of milestones because, as I said, there's a lot of duplication in the way that this is laid out. And then we have the milestones that were completed. And by completed, we mean a milestone where there was enough evidence to say, yes, this was actually done. We can check it off the list, and we had agreement among ourselves on that. So completed. And then we had a few milestones that were partially completed. And by partially completed, we basically meant a number of the milestones, you will notice, have several metrics embedded within them. And so some of the partially completed ones, well, maybe they met some of the metrics, but not all of them. And another example is there was a CDC milestone where the milestone was to complete 2 clinical trials involving TB therapy for prevention of multi-drug resistant TB. They did one very extensive study. So they met sort of the essence of the metric, but they didn't do 2. So we've called that partially completed, and they were okay with that. And then in progress, there were a few milestones that are in progress. And in progress means that they really have been started. They're in progress, and they got delayed for one of several reasons. One obvious reason that we've all been dealing with is COVID kind of pushed things back a bit. Another reason was, and this is applicable to USDA and FDA, there was some funding that didn't come until 2017, and they were supposed to do 2 surveys. I'm going to talk more about these surveys a little bit later. They did one in 2017. The intention was to do one a few years later. So now that's been pushed outside the 2020 boundary, but it will happen sometime in 2021. So that's another reason things got pushed back. A third reason might be if it just takes a lot longer, particularly working with some of the things in the international space, it just takes longer than you think. And so that was another reason for things being in progress. And I'm going to make a point now that I'll make again. Several of the agencies said to us, when they put together the plan, they were told to be aspirational, really think big, think high level, think of what you could possibly accomplish. And I think that that's great to be aspirational, but when the rubber hits the road and you're trying to measure success and progress, sometimes if you're a little too on the aspirational side, it's hard to meet some of your goals and objectives. So I just want you to keep in mind, and I'll repeat that point at the end of this presentation. So then we have the milestones that were not achieved. And a milestone that's not achieved is one that really was not initiated to any significant degree. And we've passed the point, that 2020 time has ended. And so we have 5 milestones that have not been or were not completed. Can I have the next slide, please? So if you look at this just summarizes what I said. This is going by the actual number of milestones. So there are 230 milestones in the plan. 215 are fully completed. I'm waiting to hear back from EPA on 1 milestone. I think it's going to be completed, so I think that's going to jump up to 2016. We had 4 that were partially completed. We had 5 that were in progress. And again, we only had 5 that were not achieved. And that's only 2.2%. So I think that's a remarkable record, especially for a program whose intention was to be somewhat aspirational. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just cover briefly, I thought you might be interested in hearing a little bit about the milestones that were not achieved. The first one was CDC will expand capacity to prevent the importation of cases of MDR-TB by doubling TB screening among migrants from high incidence countries from 500,000 to 1 million persons per year. And, that was not completed because of the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. So this is one where CMS will begin the process of proposing new inpatient quality report, IQR rules for requiring hospitals to report antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance to NHSN as part of the IQR program. And this is a little bit complicated, but there is no mandate at this point. This did not move forward. CMS did have a public comment period asking for information on it, or comments on such a rule, but they never started getting into the process. And so there is no mandate at this point. However, when we were talking to CDC, they made a couple of interesting points. One is voluntary reporting continues to expand. And CDC is working very hard with a number of different hospital and healthcare systems to try to really push the voluntary reporting of this. And there's a real incentive for hospitals to do this because it benefits them as well to have those kind of data. So there's a big push to do voluntary. And then another key point is that part of the reason some hospitals are not doing this is they don't have the infrastructure in place. They don't have the electronic technological capacity to send the data in the appropriate format. So hospitals are trying to get that done. And then, more and more hospitals will come on board with this. Another thing, if you've read the plan carefully, is, there's sort of this effort right around where this comes into the document of looking at trying to not create too much regulatory burden. Are there alternatives to regulation for hospitals? And so again, as I said, CDC is working very hard to kind of push this without the regulation. But CDC has also said this is not off the table. It's still a possibility. But we counted it as not achieved because no real progress had been made on this particular milestone. Next slide. The next one is CDC will establish up to 10 additional EIP sites, emerging infections program sites, including sites in the West and Midwest that will monitor drug-resistant pathogens. And this was not done in part owing to limited resources. It takes a lot of money to set up one of these EIP sites, and it's a big lift, and 10 is a really big lift. So what CDC did do was they increased the number of pathogens being reported by existing EIP sites. And they also said to us and in the GAO report that they really, when kind of going back, they didn't think that adding 10 sites was really worth the resources it would take that would be a lot of resources, and so they kind of reprioritized this in terms of a lot of other things, and they feel that they could accomplish what they wanted in terms of surveillance by increasing the number of pathogens. So this was not this particular milestone was not achieved. Next, please. So this one is that HHS will establish a process that allows product developers to provide data to CMS for use in developing interpretive guidelines that facilitate the use of tests for patient treatment, hospital infection control, and reporting of cases of disease during outbreaks. And when we talked to HHS about this, they determined that CMS does not have the authority to ask for this information in the manner described in this milestone. Therefore, it's just simply not possible. They don't have the authority. They can't do this. And that was not known when the plan was written. Next slide. So this is that a milestone for CBD and CBDP and DTRA. And this is for submitting an investigational new drug IND application to FDA to initiate the clinical investigation of an antibiotic developed with DoD funding. Now, this IND was expected to be for Emergent Biosolutions compound GC072. And the problem here is that this particular compound could not move forward because it failed toxicology studies in 2019. And so that was not anticipated and not known. Again, meaning that this particular milestone, they thought they could do this with this compound, but they were unable to move forward because of the failure to complete the toxicology studies. So I think that's the last one. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so that's the last one on the 5 milestones that weren't met. And then now what I want to do is I kind of want to move into some agency highlights, because I also felt that it was important for you all to have an understanding of some of the key successes and what are the agencies the most proud of, and what do they think are the most impactful and the most powerful accomplishments that they had during this 5 years. So I'll start with HHS. HHS, ASPE has coordinated the CARB task force. And this coordination is really, really important, and it's been shown to be really valuable. We had several agencies say to us, that the coordination at the federal level was really impressive. This was a real model. This is something that, is really unique. People worked incredibly well together. It was very well organized. So I think that this is a really a high accomplishment on the part of HHS. HHS has also done a lot of work internationally, and I didn't go into a lot of the details here in the interest of time, but they did help move forward the WHO Global Action Plan on antimicrobial resistance, and they have worked on a lot of other levels in the international space, trying to move international partners forward on this issue. And now I'll go in, and then of course, all of the HHS agencies had huge accomplishments, and we have BARDA, CDC, CMS, FDA, and NIH, and I'll talk about each one of those in the next few slides. So can I have the next slide, please? So first I'll go with BARDA. These are sort of in alphabetical order. CARB-X has really came to mind when we asked BARDA, what is your biggest accomplishment? And I think you all know about CARB-X. CARB-X is the biopharmaceutical accelerator. The purpose of CARB-X is to promote a diverse portfolio of products that can be moved from early stage development further down the pipeline into later stage development. And CARB-X started out as a US initiative, and they now have international partners and philanthropic organizations, and I think some external governments. I think the UK is part of this. And so far, they have invested $300 million in 87 projects around the world. And this kind of effort to incentivize companies is absolutely critical to companies and researchers to get these products started and get them moving and get some interest around them. So CARB-X was really, I think BARDA felt, well, that was their #1 big accomplishment. The other thing that BARDA achieved was they got 3 antibiotics approved through FDA, and I've shown the 3 of them there. And this really kind of helps to demonstrate how BARDA works with non-dilutive funding to incentivize companies, to promote product development, and ultimately to move products into the marketplace. So this kind of shows the success of their model. And so these were 2 of the biggest highlights from BARDA. And like I said, I'm just going to give you a few highlights just in the interest of time so you can get a flavor of some of the diversity and some of the different things that were done. I'm not going to go into every detail, but But this is what I think rose to the top for BARDA. Next slide, please. And then for CDC, there were a number of accomplishments. One was the AR lab network, this lab network of really promoting antimicrobial resistance testing, including whole genomic sequencing. This is active in all state health departments and a number of big cities, city health departments, and in Puerto Rico, I believe. So it's really, and they have 7 regional labs that do testing, and they've identified the 7 regional labs and set up that network of coordination and sharing information across the country. So I think that getting this up and running is a really, really important issue. And also this, according to what the CDC folks said, they said this has sort of fundamentally transformed how the US is able to respond to emergency threats. That this network has really, really been essential, and it really is a multi-use. Yes, it's mainly for antibiotic resistance, but you're building public health capacity that can be used in other ways as well. For example, the COVID response. I mean, this asset sort of got pulled into helping with that, kind of, showing that double use. Another thing that CDC mentioned was the CDC and FDA antibiotic resistant isolate bank. This bank gathers resistance bacteria through their surveillance activities. CDC makes the isolates and the panels available for research and for diagnostic and drug development. And I believe they have 29 different panels and over 200,000 isolates available. So this is a very big resource, and they're continually adding to it, and very, very important for R&D research. Another thing that CDC mentioned was their innovation portfolio. CDC does have an innovation portfolio on ways to use science in preventing the development of resistant organisms. During this project, they invested $32 million at least, and they had 60 different projects around the world. So they also thought that this was a big accomplishment to have this innovations portfolio. Next slide, please. CDC has also done a lot to build infrastructure. As you know, CDC works very closely with state and local health departments. And on the CDC website, you can find the AR interactive map, and you can kind of see what resources, what projects they've invested, and they've invested all across the country to I think most, if not all, state health departments and some big city health departments, et cetera. So they've been, so this is really critical, this public health investment, because you've got to get funding out to the states. You can't do it all at a federal level. So much has to happen at the state and local level. So building that critical infrastructure is something that CDC was able to do. And that is a huge asset and a very, very valuable network for working locally on stewardship and antibiotic resistance issues. CDC has also worked very extensively with the healthcare community in lots and lots of different ways. And I just used this slide. I just pulled it off of their website as an illustration. But they have the program Be Antibiotics Aware to help with prescribing. But they've done so many other things. I mean, they've all of their core components of stewardship, all of the promoting of stewardship, all of that work has really increased, again, infrastructure in the healthcare system for being able to impact on resistance trends, and also all of the data that they're collecting through their antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance modules for HSSN is really important in terms of getting the surveillance systems in place. So a lot of this work on this particular slide shows some of that infrastructure that is actually so critical for success for people who work in the public health arena. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of CMS, we didn't actually get a full readout from CNS on this, but two things that we thought were really, really important was the Medicare rules for long-term care that incorporated stewardship that were published in 2016. That was really, really important. And then the next one was in September, CMS finalized new regulations that require U.S. hospitals to develop and implement antibiotic stewardship programs. Again, kind of moving us into this being the norm. Next slide, please. And FDA also had a number of great highlights. One was the isolate bank that they share with CDC that I've already talked about. Another really big thing for FDA was the veterinary feed directive, the final rule for this. and that really deals with use of medically important antibiotics in animal feed. And so trying to change practice around the use of antibiotics in animal feed is a very, very, very important issue. And FDA kind of led that charge. So that's a really big accomplishment from FDA. And FDA also said that they've worked with a lot of external, I didn't put this on the slide, but their work in building relationships and building connections with a lot of external partners has really been instrumental in kind of helping move the science forward, move these companies forward. So they've done a lot of work in that arena as well. Next slide. Okay, so NIH also mentioned CARB. They worked on that with BARDA. I've already talked about that a little bit. Two other really big highlights for NIH were the National Database of Antibiotic Resistant Organisms. I mean, this is a very large database that is available on the NCBI site, and it's a database of genetic material of genes, resistance genes that can be accessed by different users, and it's really an opportunity to for users to edit, kind of curate, and expand on the data that are in this database. So this is a really rich resource and a really important piece of basic science and R&D. Another thing that they mentioned was their diagnostic prize test. They did do a diagnostic prize, and this led to the development of a new point of care diagnostic for STIs, particularly drug-resistant gonorrhea, and that was a big success as well. Next slide. So also for NIH, they've done a lot in terms of supporting clinical trials. They have expanded and strengthened the antibiotic resistance leadership group. They have also completed several clinical trials to inform optimal use of existing antibiotics. They've also worked a lot in developing non-traditional therapeutics such as phage therapy, antivirulence inhibitors, monoclonal antibodies, and microbiome-based approaches that are kind of on the forefront and on the cutting edge of where things may be going over the next years. Next slide. So DoD, a lot of their work is sort of really in the clinical space. They created a centralized laboratory network, which has allowed them to identify emerging threats early, such as Candida auris. They've implemented a web-based applications for their clinicians, so they have so those clinicians have relevant information about stewardship available to them at their fingertips through this mobile app. And then they established an ASP working group to really help identify issues and as a structure for solving any issues within the DoD organization. And this includes their Epidata Center, their multi-drug resistant organism repository and surveillance network, and the Pharmacovigilance Center. Next slide. So EPA, EPA was not highly involved in the 2015-2020 plan. They really only had a couple of milestones. But one of the things when we were talking to someone at EPA, he said that, we realized through the plan that there really is an important role for the environment. And we really changed our thinking based on that plan, even though that they didn't have a lot specifically to do in the plan. They said it was really, they really got it, and they really realized how important this is, and they've really made it a priority for the next plan. I mean, EPA is going to be much more involved, and they really also did some work, kind of background work, to establish links with programs to kind of start building, their part of the One Health perspective into surveillance and monitoring. And more recently, they had entered into a formal agreement for working with NARMS, the National Antibiotic Resistance Monitoring System, to having an environmental working group as part of that. So again, it's filling out the One Health approach and moving into the future and the next plan with that. Next slide. USAID has done a lot of work internationally. And when we talked to the person at USAID, one of the points that she made is, a lot of their work over the last few years has really been targeted towards building the infrastructure, getting the countries to develop plans, starting to implement those plans. It's really a lot about infrastructure building. So she broke it down into several headings for us. One is governance. They provided a lot of support to countries to develop national action plans, and then work on preventing infections. They strengthen infection prevention and control measures in a number of different ways, as shown on this slide. And then working with USAID support, some of their partners have pioneered an initiative called the Clean Clinic approach, which is a quality improvement strategy to strengthen wash, water, sanitation, and hygiene in health facilities. Next slide. They've also worked on surveillance, providing technical assistance, training, and commodities, and testing in commodities to strengthen laboratory capacity to detect AMR. Obviously, it's critical to have the surveillance, and I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Surveillance data more in a minute. And then stewardship and case management. You know, they've supported the development of stewardship plans. They've provided support in 25 countries to strengthen timely diagnosis and management of severe bacterial infections to make sure that people are getting, you know, the right drug at the right time at the right dose. They're supporting the correct diagnosis, assessment, and care of patients according to evidence-based guidelines to promote judicious use of antibiotics. So they're covering a lot of different areas and working in many different parts of the world. Next slide. And then USDA has also done a lot of different things in sort of in the One Health space. One is these national animal health monitoring system surveys that they conducted in 2017. They did one on feedlots and one in swine operations, and their intention was to try to do two in the 5-year period. But again, they didn't get the funding for the first one until 2017, and now, as I said earlier, they're moving this back a little bit, and we'll do the second one in 2021. But these provided a lot of important information to understand antibiotic use and practices before the veterinary feed directive went into effect. And now they want to look at the impact after the feed directive has been in effect for a while. And some of the information that has come out of this is really important for that sort of drivers of change, which is one of their issues, to try to look at what can they do. And they found some things in some of these studies that I think can be helpful in that capacity. So these surveys are something that they came back to several times as generating extremely valuable information for them. Next slide. They've also expanded, along with FDA, the National Animal Health Laboratory Network, and this provides a better. They've included more AMR testing and more AMR work in this, and it provides a better understanding of resistance to animal pathogens, both livestock and companion animals. And you can see in April 2021 where that testing is being done and where those laboratories are located. So they thought this was a big success. Next slide. So a couple of other things for them. They, as I said, they've expanded their AMR testing. They've included more commodities in their testing, and they've initiated a program on cecal sampling, which is important. They've also conducted whole genomic sequencing for NARMS, for the National Antibiotic Resistance Monitoring System, and they're publishing those data in the national database in near real time. So that's available. And then they've done a fair amount of research and funding, both through ARS, the Animal Research System, and the or Animal Research Service, I'm sorry, and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. So a lot of research going on from them as well. Next slide. And then the VA has focused mostly clinically. They have functional stewardships in all of their VA centers, regardless of the type of center. All 140 centers have stewardship programs, are in compliance with their VHA Directive 1031, and all of them report data on antibiotic use to CDC. So that's a huge accomplishment from the VA perspective. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the barriers and challenges, because I think this is very important to sort of understand as we're looking at progress on the report, on the plan. So first, AMR is highly complex. I mean, I think we all know this. It involves so many different pathogens. I mean, there are 18 different pathogens in the 2019 threats report. These pathogens are very diverse. Their treatments are diverse. Their prevention and control is different. So it's not a one size fits all. It's not a simple problem. It's an extremely complicated problem. Secondly, harmonizing a One Health approach across different sectors adds another layer of complexity. You can't just be working with a few agencies. You've got to be working across, human health, animal health, environment, et cetera. It's really, that adds complexity, and it adds the need for a lot greater coordination. It's great because it's important and we got to do it, but it does add a layer of complexity that I think needs to be acknowledged. Several agencies brought up limited resources to fully implement the CARB plan, and there's also funding disparities between some of the agencies. Obviously, the COVID pandemic has had an impact on much of the work outside of COVID that's been being done across a lot of different issues. And then another issue that came is just data integration and electronic data management. This is an issue for hospitals that want to report AUAR data. It's also an issue for, like I said, the VA and DoD systems. So I'm trying to get everybody up to improving their data management capabilities is a big challenge. And if we want to do surveillance for some of these issues, well, that's really a critical piece of it. Next slide, please. So public health resources, the capacity needs at the state, CDC said, are about, what states have asked for is about half of what they've been able to deliver, that CDC has been able to deliver in terms of support. And so there's really a lot more capacity out there at the state and local level where more, additional resources could really help move some more things, move the needle a little bit more at the state and local level. Another thing that CDC mentioned was that funding cycles for the states aren't always consistent and sustained. Like states may get a big bolus of funding and it's got to be used, within 2 years or a year, and then the funding goes away and there's no sustainability. The analogy they used was sort of the flash flood for funding. And I think that's a really important thing to think about from a policy perspective when we're allocating funding, to try to have sustained level funding so that these programs can gradually move forward and be sustained and be successful. In agricultural outreach, some unique issues there are much of the work on farms is voluntary, and therefore producer trust and developing supportive industry groups is really key. And one of the things they mentioned is sort of a barrier or a big challenge for them is risk communication. They need that risk communication to ensure that voluntary participation. Next slide, please. And then there's the whole area of drug discovery and development. Excuse me. Lack of adequate funding for drug development is an issue. The pipeline for AMR drugs is a challenge. I'm sure you guys all know this. And there are not a lot of companies in this space at this time. And one thing that was mentioned was the need for more pull incentives. Pull is sort of from the marketplace, kind of pulling a product along, as opposed to the push, the non-dilutive funding kind of side of things. We really need both, and I'll mention the other one in a minute. But there's more needs to be thinking about the pull, like how do we pull these along into the marketplace. And then this goes along with the next one, which is incentivizing industry to invest in the development of new drugs. And that can be a challenge because there's a big risk to these developments if you don't know if a product is going to be successful. Finally, the regulatory pathway for some of these non-traditional therapeutics that we'd mentioned, such as microbiome therapy or phage therapy, we don't know the regulatory pathway at this point, and that requires some additional clarification. Next slide. Last set of challenges are international. As I mentioned, surveillance is really key. A lot of ministries of health are reluctant to invest in efforts or programs unless they can clearly demonstrate why something is a health priority, because they have so many competing priorities. It makes it very challenging. If you don't have enough resources to do everything, you've got to go for the biggest bang for your buck as you can. And so adequate surveillance is really needed to say, yes, this is a problem. And a lot of countries don't have that surveillance. And it becomes a little bit of a chicken and an egg. They can't get the surveillance data. They can't get the funding. They can't get surveillance. They don't have funding to do surveillance. So it becomes kind of a chicken and egg kind of thing. And so adequate surveillance is a really important issue. And then, a lot of plans have developed, or a lot of countries have developed national action plans, but they don't have the resources to implement them. And that's a big challenge and barrier. As I mentioned, data reconciliation is not just apply to the US, it's an international issue. And some systems are really based on different standards, and it's very difficult to try to do data integration when you have different standards. And there are lots of other differences here, as in that last bullet, differences in terminology, methodology, regulatory structures, resistance patterns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very difficult to work with this on a global scale. Next slide. So now I'd just like to talk a few minutes about some key lessons learned. Several agencies mentioned that political will has been essential to success. And the US government really put up a lot of political will to make this happen with funding, with support for the CARB efforts. So political will has really, really been important and is a major driver of the success. Another thing, as I mentioned earlier, NAP is really a model for successful collaboration across the U.S. government. And I do hope that this model itself is studied well enough to see how this can be implemented for other problems and issues that we face. AR prevention through public health action is possible. This 5-year plan demonstrated that you can actually have an impact through public health action. Another point that was made is the One Health approach has been validated, including the importance of the environment, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. And then another thing we can't lose sight of is that the capabilities that are built can be used for other things and can support us in terms of general infrastructure for public health emergencies and other public health issues. Next slide. So this gets into the R&D issue again, and I talked a little bit about this, figuring out ways to de-risk R&D, and that's a lot of what CARB Access sort of provides some of that funding, but providing companies with the needed support to advance their products and get across that valley of death where they're trying to determine if their product is going to make it before they're generating any revenue. There's a lot of money put in, and if a product fails, they've lost a lot of money. So I think we need to have a balance. I mean, I've dealt with this in other issues where, yes, pharmaceutical companies have a very important role to play, and they need to. I mean, this is what they do, but there needs to be some partnership to help support some of the cost to advancing products, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And then, as I mentioned, the pull incentives earlier, the push is also important to get early stages of discovery, to really fund, promising, what are some new ideas that can be very promising. And this seems to be, one agency said this was an important bottleneck. And then on the international level, trying to come up with some consistency, measurable targets that are consistent, tools that can consistently assess capacity in similar ways, and then guidance for use of those is needed. Next slide. So I only have 2 more slides, and this will be quick. So I also wanted to kind of look a little bit at what are some of the progress towards targets. I mean, obviously that's the bottom line. I mean, I think it may be early to really measure targets because, as I said, a lot of what I kind of learned was a lot of the first 5 years is really getting things in place, moving things forward, really having that infrastructure and the programs in place to really have further impact down the road. But I did pull this slide off of the CDC website. One of the things they referred me to for looking at progress was this 2019, AR threats report, which we had looked at. And so this slide, I think, nicely sort of illustrates some of the successes, some of the drops, some fewer deaths from antibiotic resistance in hospitals, for example. Decreases in certain pathogens such as VRE, multi-drug resistant Pseudomonas, drug-resistant Candida, carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter, MRSA. We have not seen the needle move much for carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae. It also hasn't moved much, it's not on this slide, but for drug-resistant Salmonella. And there's a few other pathogens that CDC doesn't yet have data for, but because we talked a little bit about this in our meeting, but they're trying to get the data. But I think the point here is that there has been progress, that we have seen some decreases, and it does illustrate, as I said earlier, one of the important points that prevention actually can work. Next slide, please. And I believe this is the last slide. So on the last slide, I do have some conclusions that I wanted to share with you. The first is that implementation of the CARB plan was highly successful, as evidenced by milestone completion. And given the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that this was intended to be an aspirational plan, the U.S. government agencies are committed to this work with highly dedicated staff that we were very impressed with. The plan has fundamentally changed the ways various stakeholders, both in the US and outside the US, think of AR, and it really elevated this topic to an issue of national and international concern, which is a really, really important consideration. And then, as I mentioned earlier, implementation of the plan has built important infrastructure that will have long-term benefits, both in terms of antibiotic resistance, but also in terms of other issues that may come up over time. And then finally, the need for continued and sustained funding is sort of essential for all of these processes to continue to move forward over the next 5 years as we move into the 2020-25 plan. My next slide is just this question. So that's my main conclusion. And Jose, if you want to go to the next slide, great. Okay, good. So any questions or any comments from anybody? I think we have about
Andy
10 minutes left.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you, Chris. That was great. As you did your research and reflect on findings, including challenges, gaps, and lessons learned, and recognizing it was probably beyond scope, we're now about 16 months into a new plan, the 2020-2025 National Action Plan. Did you get a sense of to what extent the new plan is informed by some of what you've called out here in terms of challenges, gaps, and lessons learned? Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Andy. We didn't specifically go into the plan, into the next plan, into the future. But I will say there are some things that did come up. One of the things that people said was, we put so many things into this first plan, like 230 milestones is a lot of milestones. And so if you look, and I'm sure you've all looked at the 2025 plan, it's a lot simpler. First of all, there's not nearly as many sort of those processy types of milestones. Another thing that people told me was that they tried to focus a little bit more on outcomes, trying to be really things that are easy to measure. So looking at those things that are truly measurable, and then a little bit more focus on outcomes. That was another comment that was made. And then, as I mentioned, for EPA, I think EPA intends to be much more engaged in the next plan as part of the One Health. And I also think another thing that came up was just the focus on One Health in the next plan, the importance of that. Those were the things that kind of come to my mind. I'm trying to think in reading the 2025 plan, if anything else was really informed. Because we didn't specifically ask that, I don't have a lot to say on that particular issue, but those are some of the things that I think people mentioned. And I think also, the last plan was very aspirational, as we said. They did an amazing job, given how aspirational it was. And I think that they were trying to really be a little bit more targeted, a little bit more, let's see what's realistic to accomplish. So that may have I think that probably did inform the direction they went with that next plan.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Got a question from Lefteris, and then Mary has one that I'll pull out of the chat.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. Thank you. This is great work. I hope that you can hear me.
I can hear you, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I was hoping that you could give us some insights of how you evaluated the feedback that you received and how you validated if a target was completed or not. Kind of your validation.
And that's
if you don't mind, I'll ask my second question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll ask my second question that's a little specific. It has to do with CARB-X, because you mentioned CARB-X as an accomplishment brought to you from both BARDA and NIH, and really it's something remarkable. And CARB-X recently announced that they are not going to extend any new funding, that they're going to use the resources for the 80 total awards that they have already going. Mm-hmm. And they said they're going to have new announcements only if they receive new funding. Does this piece of information change the excitement about CARB-X and what it's going to accomplish from here moving forward? Thank you. Thank you for good.
Yeah, those are both good questions. And the question of validating. So as I said, Angie and I both went through a lot of information before we even talked to anybody at any of the agencies. We tried to find everything that we could online. For example, if it was about like the whole thing about like new laboratory network, that's an easy thing to find online. So we found that. We really scoured the websites of these different agencies to try to find supporting evidence, because obviously it's very important that we have actual evidence. And then, so we did that work on our own. And then there were some gaps, there were some questions. Most of the work that we did Like say if we had a milestone and we said, yes, this milestone was met, and we had the evidence that we had, very few agencies changed that. Very few changed like the yes, that they met the milestone. What they did do sometimes was they added content that we had missed, that we couldn't find, or, you know, that we just didn't have access to. So they expanded on some things. But most of the things that we had identified as a yes really didn't change. There were some that we had in our, you know, in the process of this that we put unclear. And that's where we drilled down with our agency personnel. And if it was something, and again, we wanted some objective evidence for that, you know, trying to say, you know, yes, this is, we can actually see that this was met. But some of the things, like, for example, there's one kind of vague milestone in there that says NIH, CDC, FDA, EPA will all ensure that annually they review their research priorities and make sure that they direct resources to antibiotic resistance areas as a high priority. And that's not written down anywhere. And so, like, for example, when the agencies told us, they would say, well, yes, we have this review committee, and the review committee sits down, and the review committee does A, B, and C, and D, and all that stuff. And they validate it that way. So they had to, they couldn't just say to us, yes, we did that. We want to say, well, how did you do that? And what was the process for that? And then we also often ask that if things were documented, and if they could document for us, great. And a lot of things that we added, they were able to document. So we tried to have evidence be documented, but sometimes our evidence was relying on what they told us. And I think that was the best that we could do. And I think when we write the report, we'll have to put that caveat in, because some of these things are just not measurable. You know, you can't find them. So, but we'd spend a lot of time talking to people, and sometimes we would go over a milestone. We say, now, are you sure does that really meet the milestone? Let's talk about that more in depth, and show us some evidence. So we did do this kind of back and forth with the agencies on that. And I think, again, we did our best on some of these things. I think one of the things for the final report is we do need to really go back and make sure that we're really comfortable with the way things are categorized right now. And we try to also really sort of stick to what the milestone said. Like if a milestone said to interact with a group of international agencies to ultimately accomplish something, but the milestone was really just about the interaction, not about getting whatever it was done the way the milestone was worded. So we tried to be very careful with how the milestones were languaged as we went through this process. Again, we were a little bit rushed. We only really had a couple of months to do this work. And so we need to go back and, you know, as I said, that we have a little bit of time now, a little bit of breathing room to go back and kind of check and make sure that we're really comfortable with where everything is, which is, again, why things may change a little bit. But I feel actually pretty good about it. I feel pretty good about our conversations with people. I feel pretty good about the evidence that we found. I know that there's a lot more we could add in, for example, in publications. I mean, you know, there's a lot of publications that came out. We didn't try to find every publication on every one of these. There was just, you know, that was too big of a lift for us. And then getting to your next issue, I think the fact that CARB still has these 80 awards in progress, I think is fabulous. And I think it's a call to hope that there will be additional funding. I don't know if I can say much beyond that. I don't really know the ins and outs of that well personally.
I want to be respectful of your time, Chris. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, we'll just take one more question before we end the session, because I noticed that, Ruka, you had your hand up, so I want to call on you. One more question, and then we'll close the open session. Because I know we could ask you questions for about another hour or two. So.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Unfortunately, I really wanted to know the answer to Mary's question, probably more than mine. But I just wanted to ask whether, I mean, it was a really extended process that you went through that involved, you know, a lot of skill with interviewing and knowing who to speak to and so on. So that was really nice. But I'm wondering whether in doing it, whether you have any ideas for how to improve monitoring and evaluation of the ongoing plan and national action plans in future that could use the knowledge that you gained during this process to be able to do this in a more automated way? I don't know whether my question is clear.
Yeah, and that's a really, really good question. There's another project I'm working on now that we're just about to begin embarking on a monitoring evaluation plan. So I've been thinking a lot about this. I do think it needs to be, and I don't know the inner workings of how everything has been done for the progress reports, but I think systematically looking at progress, and this is sort of an internal thing that, and I don't know, I may be overstepping my bounds in saying this, but systematically looking at progress towards each milestone and then doing course corrections along the way. I don't really honestly know how much of that was sort of done over the last 5 years, but is there a way, if something isn't being accomplished, well, what are some of the barriers to that, and what's the adjustment piece of that might be necessary, and really trying to go through it, very systematically. I'm not sure if that was done in the first, but I think that is always a useful way to approach monitoring, evaluation, and adjustment if that's what you're trying to do.
Chris, if I may, can I sneak one more in, because I kind of jumped over Mary, but whose question was in the chat, and I turned my chat off. She asks, did you find any areas with duplication of efforts? Obviously there's overlap, but where you thought there was excessive duplication that could be clarified?
That's a good question. I don't think so. It seems to me, there were certainly situations where I'll use USDA and FDA, for example, where they worked closely together on a milestone or on a series of milestones. But I wouldn't say it was, I don't think it was a duplication of effort. I think it was a synergism, more of a synergism of effort. I really, and again, I'd have to kind of go back and Angie and I will kind of keep this question in mind. It looks like things were pretty well delineated by who was responsible for what. And I don't think I would consider there to be a lot of duplication of effort or wasted effort. I think there were some really fabulous synergistic efforts for a lot of agencies, but I really honestly nothing that comes to my mind that's really truly duplicative.
All right. Thank you. I think we're going to close the session because, again, I just think we go on and on because you've got obviously a wealth of information that really touches on the charge to our committee. But I want to thank you, Chris, and Angie as well for all the work you've done. We look forward to the final report, but really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. And if you do have other questions and you want to go through Jillian to share with me, and obviously you'll have a chance to look at the report and ask questions there. I think this has been very helpful, just these little bits of questions. I think we really need to be very careful in terms of how we summarize, whether a milestone is met, and be maybe a little bit more rigorous on that. I think I need to go back and kind of look at that. I think we did that, but I want to double check. So that's very helpful for me. But if you have other questions, feel free to reach out through Jillian, and I'm happy to entertain anything I can, any way that we can be helpful. We want this to be a service to you and to the agencies. We want to be helpful in this process. And if this information can be helpful, that's our intention. So anything we can do, you just let us know.
Super. Thank you very much, Chris.
Yeah, thank you all. Yeah, take care, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity. Bye.